Inflation is one of the most misunderstood forces in human history. Most people believe inflation means prices going up. That belief is not only incomplete, it is dangerously wrong. Prices do not rise on their own. Prices are symptoms. Inflation is the disease. Inflation is what happens when money itself is weakened, diluted, and stripped of its purchasing power. When a government creates more currency than the economy produces in real goods and services, every unit of that currency becomes worth less. The numbers on price tags rise not because things suddenly become more valuable, but because the money measuring them becomes less valuable. This distinction matters because if you misunderstand inflation, you misunderstand why societies collapse. You misunderstand why savings vanish. You misunderstand why people work harder yet feel poorer every year. And you misunderstand why nations that appear wealthy on paper can descend into chaos within a single generation. Inflation does not announce itself loudly at first. It does not arrive with panic or headlines or warnings. It enters quietly. A few extra bills printed here, a small deficit justified there, a crisis, a war, a recession, a political promise. Every justification sounds reasonable in isolation. Every expansion of money feels temporary. Every decision is framed as necessary. But inflation is cumulative. It compounds silently, and by the time people realize what is happening, the damage is already irreversible. Money is not wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. Real wealth is food, energy, housing, labor, technology, skills, land, and productive capacity. Money is only valuable because it represents a claim on those things. When the supply of claims grows faster than the supply of real goods, the claims must lose value. This is not ideology. This is arithmetic. Throughout history, every civilization that destroyed its money eventually destroyed itself. Not because people became greedy or lazy or immoral, but because money is the coordination mechanism of society. It tells people what to produce, where to work, what to save, and how to plan for the future. When money stops working, planning becomes impossible. Long-term thinking disappears. Trust collapses. People shift from building to surviving. At first, inflation feels manageable. Wages rise. Prices rise. Governments assure citizens that everything is under control. Official numbers are adjusted. Baskets are reweighted. Definitions are changed. Inflation is renamed transitory, supply-driven, or temporary. But inflation is never temporary once it becomes structural. It feeds on itself. Expectations change. Behavior changes. The system adapts to decay. People stop saving because saving no longer makes sense. Why store money that will buy less tomorrow? People stop investing long-term because uncertainty dominates. Businesses raise prices preemptively. Workers demand higher wages not to get ahead, but just to stay in place. Debt becomes more attractive than savings because debt shrinks in real terms as currency weakens. Prudence is punished. Speculation is rewarded. Inflation is not just an economic event. It is a psychological one. It rewires how people think. It teaches short-term thinking. It encourages consumption over preservation. It breaks the moral contract between effort and reward. When hard work no longer guarantees stability, society begins to fracture. History offers no shortage of warnings. In post-World War I Germany, the country was economically shattered, politically humiliated, and burdened with massive reparations. To meet its obligations and fund domestic spending, the government chose the path that always seems easiest in the moment it printed money. At first, the effects were subtle. Prices crept upward. Wages were adjusted. Life went on. But printing accelerated. Confidence eroded. Foreign creditors lost trust. The mark began to fall. By 1923, the collapse was total. Money lost value not over years, but over hours. Workers were paid twice per day because waiting until evening meant their wages would be worth less than at noon. People rushed from factories straight to shops, spending money as fast as possible before it evaporated. Restaurants changed prices during meals. A cup of coffee ordered at the beginning of breakfast cost more by the time it was finished. Savings accumulated over decades vanished. Middle-class families who had done everything right, worked hard, saved diligently, avoided speculation, were wiped out completely. A lifetime of discipline was erased by a printing press. The social consequences were catastrophic. Trust in institutions collapsed. Extremism flourished. When money dies, stability dies with it. In Zimbabwe, decades later, the pattern repeated with chilling familiarity. Land seizures destroyed agricultural production. Tax revenue collapsed. The government responded not by reducing spending, but by printing money to fill the gap. Again, inflation began quietly. Again, it accelerated. Again, confidence vanished. By 2008, prices doubled every 7 hours. The Reserve Bank issued increasingly absurd denominations, culminating in a $100 trillion note. When it was introduced, it could buy a few basic items. Within days, it was worthless. People abandoned money altogether. Transactions reverted to barter or foreign currencies. Employment collapsed not because work disappeared, but because money no longer functioned as payment. Working made no sense if wages could not buy food by the time you received them. Inflation does not eliminate labor. It eliminates incentives. Even countries that avoid hyperinflation are not immune to destruction. The United States, in the 1970s, did not experience total monetary collapse, but it suffered a slow erosion that permanently altered its middle class. Inflation averaged just over 7% annually, numbers that sound tame compared to Zimbabwe or Germany. But compounded over a decade, the effect was devastating. Homes became less affordable even as incomes rose. Gasoline prices exploded. Food costs doubled. Savings accounts lost purchasing power year after year. People who believed they were being responsible by saving discovered that inflation was quietly confiscating their wealth. The illusion of progress masked a reality of decline. This is one of inflation's most insidious traits. It hides behind nominal growth. Paychecks get bigger. Asset prices rise. Stock markets climb. On paper, everything looks fine, but purchasing power tells the truth. If your income rises 10% and your expenses rise 15%, you are poorer, even if your salary is higher. Inflation punishes savers and rewards debtors. It transfers wealth from those who store value in currency to those who borrow it. Governments benefit the most because inflation reduces the real value of their debts. This creates a powerful incentive to inflate, especially for heavily indebted states. The political cost of inflation is delayed, while the benefit is immediate. Once a society crosses a certain threshold, inflation becomes embedded. People expect prices to rise, so they behave in ways that make prices rise. Businesses increase prices in anticipation. Workers demand higher wages. Governments expand spending to offset public pain. Central banks face a dilemma: tighten policy and risk collapse, or inflate further and delay the reckoning. Almost always, they choose delay. Argentina is a textbook case of inflation becoming a permanent feature of national life. Once among the richest nations on earth, Argentina spent decades financing populism, subsidies, and deficits through money creation. Inflation was not an occasional crisis, it became a constant. Citizens adapted by abandoning the peso psychologically long before abandoning it physically. People stopped saving in local currency. Salaries were converted to dollars immediately. Prices were quoted in foreign currencies even when paid in pesos. Trust in banks eroded after repeated collapses and confiscations. Capital fled the country. Talent followed. Inflation hollowed out the economy from the inside. Inflation does not just reduce purchasing power. It destroys institutions. Banks cannot function without trust. Contracts lose meaning when currency values are unstable. Long-term investment disappears. Everything becomes short-term, defensive, and transactional. Venezuela demonstrates the final stage of monetary collapse. Despite possessing the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, the country descended into hyperinflation after years of deficit financing, price controls, and currency manipulation. Money creation accelerated as production collapsed. The result was inevitable. By the peak of the crisis, prices changed daily. Workers were paid in stacks of bills that filled backpacks. People rushed to stores immediately, knowing their wages would lose value within hours. Farmers stopped selling because money could not buy replacement inputs. Food shortages spread not because food did not exist, but because money failed as a medium of exchange. Inflation turned abundance into scarcity. It transformed a resource-rich nation into a humanitarian disaster. People lost weight not from dieting, but from hunger. Social order deteriorated. Millions fled the country. These are not isolated stories. They are variations of the same formula, repeated across time, geography, and political systems. The names change, the currencies change, the excuses change. The outcome does not. The early stage always looks harmless. Authorities insist inflation is under control. Official statistics lag reality. Asset owners feel richer. Debt feels manageable. The pain is diffuse and uneven, making it easy to dismiss. But inflation is cumulative. Every year of excess money creation compounds the damage. Modern inflation is often disguised by complexity, hedonic adjustments, substitution effects, core versus headline measures. Technical explanations obscure lived experience. But people do not live inside spreadsheets. They live inside budgets. When rent consumes a larger share of income, inflation is real. When groceries require trade-offs, inflation is real. When healthcare premiums rise faster than wages, inflation is real. When savings shrink in real terms despite interest, inflation is real. Inflation is not what economists debate. It is what households feel. In recent years, households across developed economies have experienced a widening gap between income growth and expense growth. Wages rose modestly. Costs rose aggressively. The difference was bridged not by productivity, but by debt, credit cards. Buy, now pay later. Longer loan terms, higher balances, lower standards. This is how inflation hides. It does not announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as stress, as exhaustion, as the feeling that no matter how hard you work, you cannot get ahead. Inflation changes behavior long before it changes headlines. People delay families, delay homeownership, delay retirement. They feel forced into riskier investments. They speculate not to get rich, but to avoid falling behind. The social fabric frays quietly. At a certain point, inflation becomes political. People demand relief. Governments respond with subsidies, stimulus, and spending. These measures treat symptoms, not causes. They require funding. Funding requires borrowing or printing. The cycle tightens. Breaking the cycle requires discipline. Discipline is politically costly. It demands austerity, reduced spending, and short-term pain in exchange for long-term stability. Few governments choose this path voluntarily. Most wait until markets force their hand. By the time confidence breaks, options vanish, capital flees, currencies fall, inflation accelerates, control is lost. Every inflationary collapse follows the same emotional arc: denial, rationalization, adaptation, panic, acceptance. People move from believing the system will correct itself to understanding that it will not. Those who adapt early survive. Those who trust official reassurances lose the most. Money is memory. It stores the value of past labor for future use. Inflation erases that memory. It disconnects effort from reward. When people realize this, their relationship with work, saving, and society changes fundamentally. This is why inflation destroys nations faster than war. War destroys infrastructure. Inflation destroys trust. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. Trust cannot be easily restored. And this brings us to the present moment. Many people sense that something is wrong, even if they cannot articulate it precisely. They feel poorer despite working more. They save less despite earning more. They rely on debt not for luxury, but for normal life. Official inflation numbers tell them everything is manageable. Their bank accounts tell a different story. This tension between narrative and reality is where monetary crises are born. Inflation is not an event. It is a process. And once that process accelerates beyond control, history shows there is no painless ending. This is only the beginning. What makes inflation so dangerous is not only what it does to money, but what it does to time. Stable money allows people to think long term. It allows them to plan decades ahead, to invest in skills, to build families, to start businesses, to save for retirement. Inflation collapses time horizons. When money loses value quickly, the future becomes irrelevant. Only the present matters. This shift is subtle at first. People do not suddenly stop caring about tomorrow. Instead, they begin discounting it. Saving feels pointless. Long-term contracts feel risky. Promises lose meaning. A culture of immediacy replaces a culture of patience. This is how inflation reshapes society from the inside out. When inflation accelerates, rational behavior changes. Hoarding becomes logical. Speculation becomes survival. Spending today becomes smarter than saving for tomorrow. These behaviors are often blamed on greed, but they are rational responses to a broken monetary system. Inflation teaches people that holding money is a losing game. Governments often misinterpret this behavior. They accuse citizens of price gouging, panic buying, or lack of patriotism. They respond with controls, regulations, and enforcement. But price controls do not stop inflation. They hide it temporarily while destroying supply. When prices are capped below reality, goods disappear. Black markets emerge. Shortages replace affordability. This pattern has repeated endlessly. Price controls in ancient Rome, price controls in Soviet economies, price controls in Venezuela. Each time, the result is the same. Shelves empty, queues grow, corruption spreads. Inflation does not vanish, it goes underground. The deeper truth is that inflation is not caused by businesses raising prices. Businesses raise prices because costs rise or because money weakens. Blaming sellers is like blaming thermometers for fevers. It addresses the measurement, not the illness. Inflation is also not evenly distributed. It does not affect all people equally. Those closest to the creation of new money benefit first. Governments spend newly created money before prices adjust. Banks lend it before its purchasing power declines. Asset owners see prices rise before wages catch up. This is known as the Cantillon effect, though most people feel it without knowing the name. Those furthest from the source of new money suffer the most. Wage earners, fixed income retirees, savers, the poor. By the time new money reaches them, prices have already risen. Inflation is therefore not just an economic phenomenon, but a redistribution mechanism. It quietly transfers wealth upward and outward, away from those least able to protect themselves. This is why inflation increases inequality even when it is described as moderate. Asset prices inflate faster than wages. Housing, stocks, and financial assets rise first. Those who own them gain paper wealth. Those who do not fall behind. The gap widens not because the rich work harder, but because money flows unevenly through the system. Inflation also distorts investment. In a stable monetary environment, capital flows toward productive uses, factories, innovation, infrastructure, efficiency. In an inflationary environment, capital flows toward hedges, real estate, commodities, speculation, leverage. Productivity suffers, growth becomes superficial. The economy appears active, but value creation slows. This is how inflation creates the illusion of prosperity, while hollowing out the foundation beneath it. As inflation persists, trust in official institutions erodes. People stop believing statistics that contradict their lived experience. When governments report low inflation while households feel squeezed, credibility collapses. Once trust is lost, communication breaks down. Policy signals no longer guide behavior. People assume worst case outcomes and act defensively. This is a critical inflection point. Monetary systems rely on belief. Fiat currency has no intrinsic value. It works only because people believe others will accept it tomorrow. Inflation weakens that belief. Hyperinflation destroys it entirely. Hyperinflation is not simply high inflation. It is a psychological break. It occurs when people stop trusting money as a store of value altogether. At that point, velocity explodes. Money changes hands as fast as possible. Prices rise not just because more money exists, but because no one wants to hold it. Once this feedback loop begins, it is almost impossible to stop without extreme measures. New currencies, dollarization, external anchors, painful austerity. Often political collapse accompanies monetary collapse. But before hyperinflation, there is a long gray zone. A zone where inflation is high enough to hurt, but not high enough to cause panic. This is where most modern economies reside. This zone is dangerous because it normalizes decline. People adapt downward. Expectations are lowered. Struggle becomes routine. In this environment, debt becomes the primary coping mechanism. Households borrow to smooth consumption. Governments borrow to maintain spending. Corporations borrow to sustain margins. Debt expands faster than income. As long as inflation continues, debt feels manageable because its real value erodes. But this creates fragility. Any attempt to stop inflation threatens to collapse the debt structure. This is the central dilemma of modern monetary systems. High debt levels make inflation tempting. Inflation makes debt manageable. But inflation also destroys purchasing power, trust, and stability. Policymakers are trapped between bad choices and worse consequences. Central banks attempt to manage this balance through interest rates. Raise rates too slowly, and inflation accelerates. Raise them too fast, and debt collapses. Every cycle becomes more extreme because debt grows larger each time. The margin for error shrinks. Eventually, the system reaches a point where stability requires constant intervention. Markets are no longer allowed to clear naturally. Failures are postponed. Losses are socialized. Moral hazard grows. Risk-taking increases because participants believe they will be rescued. Inflation thrives in this environment because discipline disappears. When consequences are delayed or avoided, excess becomes routine. The language around inflation often obscures its reality. People are told inflation is necessary for growth, that a little inflation is healthy, that deflation is dangerous. These claims are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. Mild inflation can coexist with growth if productivity rises faster. But inflation driven by money creation rather than productivity is corrosive. True prosperity comes from producing more with less. Inflationary prosperity comes from consuming more with weaker money. The former is sustainable. The latter is not. One of the most damaging myths about inflation is that it can be controlled indefinitely. History suggests otherwise. Inflation can be delayed. It can be masked. It can be exported temporarily through reserve currency status. But it cannot be eliminated without restoring balance between money and production. Reserve currency nations enjoy unique privileges. They can print money that the world accepts. They can run persistent deficits without immediate collapse. They can inflate without instant punishment. But this privilege is not permanent. It depends on trust, stability, and alternatives remaining unattractive. As debt grows and inflation persists, reserve currency status becomes less secure. Other nations seek diversification. Trade shifts. Confidence erodes slowly, then suddenly. Monetary history shows that no reserve currency lasts forever. When inflation undermines a currency's credibility, people begin seeking alternatives. Hard assets, foreign currencies, commodities, cryptographic assets, anything perceived as scarce or insulated from political manipulation. This search is not ideological, it is defensive. Governments often respond by restricting alternatives, capital controls, currency restrictions, taxes on savings. These measures aim to force confidence rather than earn it. They rarely work. Confidence cannot be legislated. It must be deserved. Inflation also affects demographics. Younger generations face higher barriers to entry. Housing becomes unattainable. Education becomes debt-financed. Family formation is delayed. Older generations with assets appear wealthier, but their purchasing power erodes as costs rise. Intergenerational tension grows. Social cohesion weakens when inflation persists. People blame different groups. Workers blame corporations. Renters blame landlords. Citizens blame immigrants or speculators. Rarely do they blame monetary policy, because it is abstract and complex. This misdirection benefits those responsible. Inflation is political because it allows governments to tax without legislation. It reduces debt without votes. It shifts blame outward. It hides costs in complexity. This makes it tempting. It is the most subtle form of confiscation ever devised, but inflation leaves fingerprints: rising inequality, falling savings rates, growing household debt, declining trust, shortened time horizons. These signals appear long before collapse. The question is not whether inflation causes harm. It always does. The question is how much harm a society tolerates before demanding change. Some societies adapt by indexing wages and contracts. Others dollarize. Some impose controls. Others collapse. There is no painless solution once inflation becomes entrenched. The pain can be distributed, delayed, or disguised, but not avoided. At the individual level, inflation forces difficult choices. People must become more financially literate. They must understand that nominal numbers lie, that savings accounts can be destructive, that stability requires protection against currency debasement. This learning curve is steep and unforgiving. Those who adapt early survive better. Those who trust narratives over math suffer more. Inflation punishes complacency. The tragedy is that inflation hurts the most responsible people first: savers, workers, retirees, people who follow rules. Speculators and debtors often benefit initially. This inversion of moral reward damages social trust. When doing the right thing leads to worse outcomes, cynicism spreads. Inflation also weakens democracy. Economic insecurity makes people vulnerable to promises of relief. Populism rises. Polarization deepens. Rational debate gives way to emotional appeals. Extreme solutions gain traction. History shows that monetary instability often precedes political instability. This does not happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, then suddenly. Years of denial give way to months of panic. The most dangerous phase is when people feel something is wrong but cannot clearly identify the cause. This creates anxiety without clarity, anger without direction, fear without solutions. Societies fracture under this psychological pressure. Inflation thrives in confusion. Understanding inflation is therefore not just an economic necessity, but a civic one. It determines how people vote, save, work, and cooperate. It shapes the future more than most visible policies. When people finally realize inflation is not temporary, not accidental, and not harmless, they ask the most important question of all: how did we get here? The answer is never a single decision. It is a series of compromises, each one justified, each one small, each one framed as necessary, until the accumulation becomes undeniable. And once that realization spreads, the system enters its most unstable phase, because belief, once broken, cannot be restored by words, only by actions, and actions are always painful. This is the reality of inflation, not as a statistic, not as a headline, but as a force that reshapes nations, societies, and lives. Every inflationary era creates its own justifications. Leaders rarely admit that money creation is the cause. Instead, inflation is blamed on external shocks, greedy corporations, supply chains, weather, wars, pandemics, speculators, or foreign enemies. These factors may influence prices temporarily, but they do not explain sustained loss of purchasing power. Only monetary expansion does that. Without excess money, price increases in one area would be offset by decreases elsewhere. Inflation requires fuel, and that fuel is currency creation. This misdiagnosis is not accidental. Admitting the true cause of inflation forces difficult choices. It requires spending cuts